Hi, I'm Sally Parks. I want to tell you a story about a story. We have been thinking for a long time in this community about the wonderful riches we have in people. And we had the opportunity to put together people stories. But I have to tell you the beginning of the story, maybe the rest of the story. Faith Mission was started in Tampa in 1923, almost 100 years ago, think of it. And it was started as an orphanage. It was started actually in an old cigar factory. And eventually they decided, and I'm going to tell you about the they in just a moment, they decided to move to Crystal Beach, which is a part of Palm Harbor, between Palm Harbor and Tarpon Springs. A small community, but a lovely one with beautiful waterfront and fresh air. The people who moved, they were Reverend Fred Markert and his wife Cora. And they were such believers in the idea that God would provide everything that was needed. So they started with virtually no money. They rented an old hotel, the Blue Heron Hotel, for $100 a month. It had 30 rooms in it, so it was a good-sized hotel. And they started taking in orphans, children that were, now remember this time, this was kind of the beginning of the Depression, the years that were really rough for a lot of people. And sometimes people had to send their children to Florida or bring their children to them. Laura Markert had an amazing ability to have faith in God. And they believed that a successful orphanage would come because people would come to support them. And they did. People brought, if you will, loaves and fishes. Products that they needed, like milk, came by the tens of gallons, even hundreds of gallons sometimes. And they ran a beautiful orphanage that was really intended to be like a family for these children as they grew up. Some of them stayed there until they were young adults and ready to go out on their own, and they had started there very early. Orphanages eventually became not just out of style, but in fact it was that the state decided that foster homes were the better place for children to live. So the orphanage closed in the 1940s, about 1947. But the facilities continued because it became homes for missionaries that were retiring, and then eventually a lot of older people were able to live there inexpensively, because by then it wasn't just the Blue Heron Hotel, but there were other buildings that had been donated to the Markerts. And it became the Markert family kind of a trust to take care of those homes. Eventually, though, the family died off, and there are still some Markerts living, but they are not living in the immediate area. So they decided that the best thing to do was to put together these assets, sell them eventually, and have that money available to be used for the community. And so this gets to our story, or another story, I should say. So one day, Terry and Fortner and I were talking about, and this was probably 12 years ago, we're talking about the fact that we were losing many of our community people that had such great stories to tell. Those stories really became oral histories for us. But how are we going to do that? How could we possibly tell their stories and keep them in some kind of documentation? Yes, you can do oral histories, that is, without the pictures, but seeing those pictures and seeing the people was really the most important part of it, not just the oral history. We were fortunate then to think about Faith Mission. They had money. Today their assets are about $3 million, or a little bit more than that. And they had money to give to the community. And because we were trying to do things, especially with the elderly, and hear those voices from the past, we just decided that it was a good place to go. So Pinellas Community Foundation, by then, was the one who was managing Faith Mission and their funds. And I sit on that Faith Mission committee. I might add that Bob Curtis, who was a part of the original group of Faith Mission, also sits, and as a matter of fact, is chair of that committee. There are 7 of us that are community-based people who make decisions about money that is to be spent, often for children, but some for the elderly too. So in 2011 or 12, we were able to get the funding for buying the equipment so we could do oral histories. We have been so fortunate that we have caught people often not long before they've passed on. And we are pleased that we have documentation of many of the early settlers in this area. There are many more. There are more stories to be told, and we want you to tell us if you know of people that should have their story told, because we're still taking that opportunity to do that. I do some of the interviews, but there are others who have done terrific interviews, like Sharon Lamb. So we're lucky to have people around. And by the way, Terry Fortner is my favorite champion, because she is the one who interviews people in advance and gives me a lot of information about how to ask the questions. And then we have the great Barb Carrier, who is our videographer, because those are people that we couldn't do this without. And we're all volunteers doing it on equipment that was purchased by Faith Mission. Thank you, Faith Mission. Thank you, Pinellas Community Foundation, Terry and Barb, and the many people that we've been able to tell their stories.